When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, where your hosts, Jamie Miller and Jennifer Bash, make sense of the chaos. Together, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your hosts, husband and wife duo, Jamie and Jennifer.
Welcome back to Reasonable Arguments, where we break down the politics without the fluff, the spin, or the nonsense. Last night, President Trump addressed Congress in a speech that, love it or hate it, made one thing abundantly clear. The political divide in this country is alive and well. And if you needed proof, just look at who clapped and who sat on their hands.
Democrats only clapped when Trump mentioned that Biden administration had sent $380 billion to Ukraine. But for a 13-year-old boy with brain cancer who was inducted into the Secret Service, silence. For the families of Jocelyn Nungare and Laken Riley, young women brutally murdered, silence. For Mark Fogel, an American detained in Russia, and his 95-year-old mother, silence. It's almost as if bipartisan decency is dead. Now, to be fair, this isn't the first time we've seen selective applause in politics, but what's different is the level of blatant pettiness. Compare this to Biden's 2024 State of the Union speech just 1 year ago. Republicans stood and clapped whenever there was a win for America. Whether they liked Biden or not, even when Biden said you can't love your country only when you win.
This is the moment to speak the truth and to bury the lies. Here's the simple truth. You can't love your country only when you win.
Everyone in the room stood and clapped. So what changed? Why is it that last night's basic moments of human decency were seen as partisan divisions?
And that's what we're breaking down today. We're going to go through the biggest moments from Trump's speech, his economic promises, social policies, immigration plans, and foreign policy. And as always, I'll be grilling Jamie with three different perspectives: the Democrat view, the Republican stance, and the centralist take. So let's get started with the most obvious elephant, or should we say donkey, in the room. Why did Democrats only stand for Ukraine funding and not for the moments it should have been universally respected?
Well, I don't know that they stood for Ukraine funding. They came in with it, and it's really kind of weird because they came in with a lack of leadership, a lack of cohesiveness, even with their clothing. We saw in that 2024 speech, I think, as we were getting prepared for this, all the women were white. This year, some were pink, some were black, some didn't care. And so there was like this lack of unified messaging. And the sitting on the hands certainly didn't jive with what I thought was a pretty good closing speech response by Senator Slotkin from Michigan. But she was talking about bipartisan leadership, a unified country, and certainly the display of Democrats for the 2 hours prior made her speech ring completely hollow.
How do Republicans view the contrast in reactions, and what does it say about the current state of the bipartisan respect?
Well, Democrats are upset that they hold majorities in neither the U.S. Senate or U.S. House, and of course that they lost the presidency in a big way. They could take some solace in the fact that they didn't lose more U.S. Senate seats and more U.S. House seats, but certainly Donald Trump winning all the swing states showed that he does have a mandate. He is doing what he suggested he would do, and Democrats don't like it. And they don't like being in charge. They don't like being called out on their hypocrisy. They don't like being called out on the crazy, loony, liberal, extreme things that they have been perpetuating to the rest of the world as normal American ideals.
How do moments like this affect the public trust in politicians and the idea of working together for the American public?
I guess it begs the question, how many people trust politicians to begin with, right? I've always said that, somebody says, I'm not a politician, I'm running for office like Trump did. Well, when you run for office, you're automatically a politician, and there's some level of distrust that people have with you. Some of it is when somebody runs, they're a little naive. They're like, hey, I can do this, I can do that. They join, let's say, a county commissioner. I want to do X, Y, and Z. I want to have the garbage picked up on time. You then join a board where you have to convince two other people to agree with you to get anything done. If that's assuming that your county commission is 5 people. So, so I don't, so people see promises made, and then they see it take a long time to have promises kept in most instances. And that builds a level of distrust, but it's kind of the way our system is built.
I think that I was aiming more towards, the American people seeing how the Democrats acted. How does that affect them or anybody as the American people outside of that seeing our own country so divided? Everybody's talking about world in Ukraine. I said, is it going to happen on our own soil?
It's kind of like one of those things people from both sides have talked about, quotes, civil war. And my question has always been like, who are you going to shoot at? Like, if let's say it comes to blows, right? It comes to guns. And, are we choosing by gender? Or how do you determine, the first Civil War was fought by states. It was geographic, and it was there were lines in the sand, literally. Here, we're talking about more of a culture war and what people believe. And more people are voting with their feet, so to speak. If you're a conservative in California and you don't have to stay in California, you're leaving because you're sick and tired of it. And yet there's liberals in Florida who are tired of being in a conservative bastion of freedom, and they decide to go live under the heavy hand of government in California.
The next part we're going to talk about is the economic policies and government efficiency. The key takeaways from last night, Trump's economic initiatives are 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico to protect U.S. industries, tax cuts on tips, overtime, and Social Security benefits for seniors, and tax-deductible car loan interest, but only for American-made vehicles, which is great. Government efficiency and budget, obviously the creation of DOGE, led by Elon, and the commitment to balancing the budget, a goal not met in over 20 years. Do Democrats see these tax breaks and tariffs as sustainable, or do they believe they could lead to economic instability?
Well, Democrats clearly don't understand them, or they don't understand the plight of the average American person, right? And because all they've talked about since the end of the speech, roughly 12 hours, 18 hours, whatever it's been, is how Donald Trump only stands for billionaires. And clearly he's standing for the American people when he says, we're going to stop income tax on tips, overtime, and Social Security. And then you throw in, if you buy your car that's made in America, you're going to get a tax break on that too. That's not a tax for billionaires. That's a tax for regular American people. And so, quite frankly, Democrats had a tone-deaf moment last night where they didn't really understand. They were petulant. They decided that they were going to make this statement of being silent. And I really think it probably, to the extent that people pay attention, I think it impacted them in a poor.
So, do you think that the no taxes on tips and overtime is a great thing? The tax deductible car loans. But are people going to argue that inflation is not coming down? The grocery bills are still high. Is that going to offset that? Will that be a positive?
You started the question talking about tariffs, and I think it's very important to understand that these are reciprocal tariffs, not punitive tariffs. And so it's not this for that, or we're punishing you. It is, you all have been taking advantage of us for decades. And Donald Trump has said, that is going to stop. If you're going to put tariffs on our products, make it harder for Americans to do business in your country, we are going to make it harder for you to do business in our country at the same tax rate, at the exact same tax rate. So I think it's very important to understand that these are reciprocal tariffs and not punitive. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, because
I went back to the beginning of the question because you threw a lot at me at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I think that I don't understand that part of it, because I understand the tariffs, but I think we're talking more about the tax cuts. Where are the tax cuts that he is implementing going to offset or going to be a positive if the inflation is not coming down? So ignore the tariffs.
Yeah, of course, tax cuts are always positive because they give more money to American people, right? And so Americans, just like businesses, can only do so many things with that money. They can invest it, they can spend it, or they can do things like, hey, I'm going to take that money and improve my home or improve the type of car I drive, or I might send my kids to a private school next year. So that money goes back into the economy in a major way, and it goes back in a way that the American citizen chooses, not some unnamed, unelected bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.
How do Republicans justify tax cuts while promising a balanced budget? And where do they plan to cut spending?
That's a great question, because we do have to grapple with this $36+ trillion worth of debt. Now, Donald Trump has come up with, some ideas that he thinks are, the golden ticket, for instance, charging wealthy immigrants $5 million apiece. And he said, oh, I'm going to have a million people for $5 trillion. Well, that puts a big chunk. Even if it's a million people over his first 4 years, taking $5 trillion off the debt would be a huge step, taking 15% of our debt and lowering it, right, in a 4-year period. You have to remember that this is debt that's been accumulating since, I think, the 70s. And so, so we're not going to fix it in 1 year. We're not going to fix it in 4, but we have to take major steps towards it. And so that's been a criticism, quite frankly, of Republicans that has happened every time they want to talk tax cuts. It's like, okay, you want to balance the budget, but you want to cut taxes. It's not an easy thing. But I think what you're seeing with DOGE is that there's plenty of places to cut to try to make up for both the tax cuts and to balance the budget.
Well, then that leads into the next question. So how does involving someone like Elon in government oversight sit with Americans who want government efficiency but are skeptical of private sector influence?
There's always private sector influence. This has been a unprecedented private sector influence, if you want to call it that, by one major person, right? And I don't know that we've ever had this before. We probably have had it before, but not this public, to be honest with you. And certainly presidents have relied on high net worth individuals throughout their presidencies for advice and everything else. But having someone in charge of pointing out these hypocrisies, pointing out these extreme liberal policies that have been ingrained in places like USAID that they're now seen as normal, is bizarre. And I think Americans see that as bizarre. And whether they like or dislike Elon Musk, I think at the end of the day, they respect the job that he's doing, and they respect the fact that he is exposing, I don't want to go as far as to say fraudulent activity, but it tap dances very close to fraud.
The next section we're going to talk about is social and cultural policies. The key takeaways from last night were education and social policies, removing critical race theory from public schools, banning transgender individuals from women's sports, making sex changes on minors a criminal offense, and declaring English the official U.S. language. How will Democrats push back on these policies, and what challenges could they face in courts or in public?
Well, they push back the same way the Democratic response pushed back. The senator from Michigan, just 24 hours earlier, she voted herself to allow boys to compete in women's sports or men to compete in college sports. And, so the hypocrisy of Democrats saying one thing out of one side of their mouth and yet doing another on the floor of the U.S. Senate, I think Americans are starting to see through that. And they're starting to see through it in a big way. I've talked to some Democrats who have been very involved and some have said, I'm starting not to recognize this Democratic Party for which I've worked for decades, and I don't know that I recognize it, and I'd like to save it. They still want to believe that they can save it. I don't know that they can save it in the way that it operated under the likes of JFK or even Bill Clinton.
I had a friend on Facebook today who said that the Democratic Party left him. He didn't leave the Democrat Party.
And that's the case for a lot of people. And growing up in the South, where I grew up, where there were no Republicans and everybody registered Democrat. And now almost everyone is Republican because the Democratic Party started leaving them in the 80s and certainly did so under Bill Clinton with his expansion of healthcare. I would say some level of banking policy, but it still is Democrats have gone down the slippery slope, but can they stop the slide? And I question whether they can or not.
How do the social policies fit into the broader conservative platform for 2025 and beyond?
I think Americans are at a point where they're ready to stop fighting the cultural wars and replace it with common sense. And for instance, we're not going to have pornography teaching same-sex relationships in kindergarten.
Actually, a friend of mine just posted on Facebook before we came on here that she heard that they are putting condom machines, this is in Michigan, in bathrooms at preschools and grade schools.
For what reason? Like, it goes beyond, it just makes no common sense. The only reason why you would is if adults are raping children.
That's exactly what I.
And if you're trying to defend any other reason, I'd like to know what it is. And because that's the only thing I can come up with why you would do that. I mean, it is abhorrent. And Democrats, like I said, they're on a slippery slope of going into obscurity because they lack common sense. And I'll tell you, it won't start in Congress. Congress may stay close, and Democrats may even take over the U.S. House in 2026, depending on the economy. But you're going to start seeing major changes in state legislative bodies that are going to stop this mess, because a lot of this stuff starts there, especially education policy. This boys and girls sports starts at the state legislative level. And so in places like Michigan and Illinois and New York, you're going to start seeing changes in those state legislative bodies. And then by 2030, you'll see a change in redistricting for the U.S. House. And if that, in fact, takes place, Democrats are likely to be in the minority in the U.S. House throughout the 2030s.
How do independent voters feel about these policies, and do they view them as necessary protections or government overreach?
It depends on the independent voter, right? I think you probably have, and it depends on the issue, and that's what makes independence kind of fun to poll. The more interesting thing about independence and polling is that today, the number one issue among independents can be education. And 3 months from now, you can poll those exact same independents, and it could be public safety. And those independents maybe lean left on education, but lean right on public safety. You can talk to the exact same focus group on those issues. And so that's why people misunderstand independence and the actual issues that lead into an election and how to reach independents and speak to them kind of with the issues that matter to them at that time.
The next section is immigration and border security. The key takeaways from last night: Trump touted historically low illegal border crossings. He announced the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, and he introduced a plan to sell $5 million gold cards to wealthy foreigners as a path to citizenship. How might Democrats counter the deportation policy while still addressing border security concerns?
So there's at least one pet peeve of mine in here, and it's when Democrats or CNN says Donald Trump isn't deporting as many illegals as Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Well, of course they're not, because they were collecting 100,000 people at the border every month and sending them across. Trump had 9,000 last month. 9,000. It dropped immediately. And so there aren't as many attempts. So if you start looking at the number of people at the border who were deported versus people who were inside the United States being deported, that's a number I would like to see. I don't have that number in front of me. I have not heard anybody report it. But the press is being disingenuous when they suggest that somehow Obama or Biden have deported more people when Donald Trump has put this effort in place to keep people from coming to our country. And that has to be recognized as a huge success for President Donald Trump.
Right.
Now, the gold card we spoke about a little bit, and I think the devil will be in the details there and we're going to do a series on the illegal immigration movement. And we have 4 CEOs of national think tanks who are going to come on the podcast, and we're going to discuss all these issues in depth. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here because there's an expert on the gold card who's going to join us. And I look forward to that conversation. And I don't want to say anything here that's going to make me look bad in front of an expert. But I do think that, one issue that we will have with gold card in the details is that for every immigrant who comes here legally, as a general rule, 13 to 14 family members follow. And so the question becomes, if we allow one person in at 5 million, what are we charging the other 13 or 14? Are they all 5 million? Or do the other 13 or 14 get to come in for free? And so then it's not 1 million people for $5 trillion. It's 14 million people.
I thought it was based on whether or not you're building a business.
That's another detail that's not really in there. If you're going to be able to afford $5 million, you're probably going to bring your business to the United States and conduct that business here. What I'm suggesting is Donald Trump has used this. I'll have 1 million people at $5 million that will create $5 trillion that we can put towards the national debt. And data will show that for every legal immigrant who comes, family members follow. And so it's not 1 million people for $5 million or for $5 trillion. It's 14 million people for $5 trillion, unless we are charging every family member $1, $2, $3, $4, or $5 million for them to come as well. And so that's why I say the devil's in the details, because we really haven't talked about the practical implication of what a legal immigrant means when they come here.
Isn't this kind of like the NIH, where the 1% genius could come over and go to school.
Look at you using the acronyms. I'm so proud of you, babe. Holy mackerel. This is something
I
I
wouldn't
never
do this
I
right
never
in the
thought
middle
I'd
of a
see.
podcast.
This is something I never
Good
thought I'd see.
Lord. Not in the middle of a podcast.
You're doing great, baby. Is this the unfiltered part?
My heart's going to start palpitating again.
I couldn't help myself.
God.
Okay. Go back. The 1%
I'm going to go
genius.
back to my scripted questions.
Yeah, right. We've always tried to attract the biggest, the best, and the brightest. But that's an issue that we start having when we have. And like I said, I don't want to get into it too much, but that's what you have when you start taking the best and brightest from undeveloped countries. There's an argument that while we may help those few people who are the best and brightest and bring them here and take advantage of their skills and brain power, we are not leaving that brain power to solve problems in their own countries. And so there is an argument that we are doing a disservice to the world by bringing the best and brightest here.
What would a successful large-scale deportation operation look like, and is it feasible?
I've always argued, going back to the campaign, that we're unlikely to deport 20 million people in the first year, even though Joe Biden let that many in over his 4 years. I think that's at least the number that he probably has let in. But we are talking about a massive effort. We've seen how hard it's been to deport the number that we have, finding, arresting, putting on a plane and deporting, and then getting countries to accept them, right? Because they don't want these criminals back. They don't want these gang members back. And they offloaded them to us. They thought they were gone forever and our problem. They would spend the rest of their lives in our jails. And that's part of it. But they don't want to pay the money to jail their criminals. So they sent them to us to commit crimes here and for us to jail. And Donald Trump says, no, you're going to get these people back, and especially the criminals. So I question the practical application of large deportation. I question how much Americans will accept, large deportations when it starts impacting, for instance, their child's best friend who's in school, and nobody really knows that their parents are illegal, and now the best friend is sent back to Colombia or wherever originating country. And so I think there will be a line. I don't know what that number is. Certainly, Americans are 100%, almost 100% on board with deporting criminals. And so I think that's where Trump has started, and we'll see where it goes from there.
The next question has to do with the gold card, so you decide whether or not you want to answer it now. But does the idea of selling citizenship to the wealthy align with American values, or does it create a two-tiered immigration system?
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it creates a two-tiered immigration system. The question is whether that's bad or not, or whether we as Americans are in such financial dire straits that we need to take an extreme measure like that. And I think there are people who, when we're going $2 trillion in debt per year, and $1 trillion of that is just servicing the debt, we have to stop that. We have to somehow claw back that $2 trillion in whether it's taxes or spending. That's basically the two ways to do it, right? So, or you create a great economy that generates more taxes, right? On the tax rates that we have today, you either get more people working, you get paid more, or whatever the case may be. And so I think we'll wait on the rest of that answer for when we have our 4-part series.
The next section is foreign policy and national defense. The key takeaways were Trump discussed Ukraine peace talks and referenced a letter from Zelensky indicating readiness to negotiate, labeled the Middle East as a rough neighborhood, promising to restore order, and proposed expanding American space exploration, including planting a U.S. flag on Mars. From the Democratic perspective, what risks come with pushing Ukraine toward peace talks, especially if Russia is still aggressive?
Donald Trump has to get folks to the table to negotiate. The one thing that is clear that people are not speaking about is when Zelensky said, and even during my BBC interview, I went back and looked at it. Remember, they switched topics on me and kind of caught me a little flat-footed. But that whole interview ended with the interviewer asking me, does the president realize that this strength that Zelensky's talking about has to be part of the deal? And so there was a little bit of foreshadowing of what happened in the Oval Office was during my BBC interview. We should put that link back in the comments, but because it was really kind of telling that the BBC was all over that. But there's no question that Zelensky, when he said the word strength, he meant American boots on the ground. And Americans do not want boots on the ground on the Ukraine-Russian border. And what Zelensky wants is American boots on the ground. So then if Russia then breaks the ceasefire, he's shooting at Americans, and now we have World War III.
Right.
And so it's not about protection. It's about creating an escalation of the war. And if we put boots on the ground, like Trump rejected rightfully in the Oval Office with the Ukrainian president in face to face, is that immediately the second we agreed to this word strength with the Ukrainian president, China and North Korea would see that as aggression towards Russia. And so now just agreeing to this word strength would have put dominoes in place. I'm not going to say they would have fallen, but they definitely would have been in place to create an environment for World War III. And that's what upset President Trump in the Oval Office. And that's why he kept telling President Zelensky, you are toying with World War III, because Donald Trump knew what Zelensky meant by the word strength. Zelensky knew what he meant by the word strength. And yet for 48 hours after that, 72 hours after that, every Democrat said, no, Zelensky didn't mean boots on the ground. But then Monday, following that Oval Office blow-up, we had Zelensky agree with Great Britain and France to put boots on the ground 30 days after a ceasefire. And so there's no question at this point. There is no question. If anybody says that Zelensky did not mean boots on the ground when he was using strength in front of the president and vice president, they're either being disingenuous or they're bold-faced lying to the American people.
How does Trump? Yeah, and I can't even tell you, like, the obstacle course he went around to get to me, so I have to kind of let him be here. How does Trump's foreign policy compare to traditional Republican stances on intervention and defense?
The devil will be in the details, and we'll see. I mean, right now, Republicans have always believed in peace through strength, and Democrats have always believed in using that strength to create wars. I mean, every war has been created under Democrat and none under Republicans. I think that's what President Trump is trying to emulate, is peace through strength. And so on the broad terms of foreign policy, I think he's much like Ronald Reagan.
Is the push for space exploration a bold vision or a distraction from pressing domestic concerns?
So, when Kennedy said, let's go to the moon by the end of this century, it was a bold vision. So I'm going to say that going to Mars is a bold vision. And, the question becomes, how much does it cost? And how much are we as Americans willing to pay for that bold vision in light of other problems? Now, we also know, the American people are still digesting all of this ridiculous money that was spent by USAID. Remember, we're going in debt to finance this war. We're the only country going in debt to finance the war in Ukraine. No other country is going in debt. And so for the war in Ukraine. And it's unconscionable that we are doing this to our grandchildren. I like the idea of public-private partnerships and figuring out a way to have Elon Musk flip most of the bill or some of the bill, and versus taxpayers paying the whole thing. But we'll see how those programs come forth.
And the last takeaway that we have is congressional reactions and political fallout. The Democrats protested parts of the speech with some lawmakers walking out, and the political divide was clear with visible frustration on both sides. What did Democrats hope to achieve with their protest, and could it backfire?
Well, I think the protests were pathetic. And quite frankly, I would give credit to the Democrats who sat through the entire speech. And I don't give them credit for not standing for the things we mentioned. The pro-American bipartisan things that the president spoke about should have been applauded and should have had a standing ovation, just like every Congress before us. Those who walked out, I think, embarrassed themselves for a TikTok moment. And certainly the fellow who did not even let the president get started with his speech before he started waving his cane was doing that for social media, not to make any real point. And they should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed by their conduct. They aren't embarrassed, but they should be. But I do give credit for those who sat through the whole thing, because Donald Trump gave them what you could only call a good old-fashioned ass whipping. And that's the truth. He went down the list of atrocities and miscalculations and misspending of money of the last 4 years done by those Democrats in that room. And they sat there and took, and they should have taken it, because they're the ones who did this to the American people. And the ones who either didn't attend or left are cowards, and they are not willing to face up to the atrocities they are perpetuating on the American people. And you have to question what they stand for at all, because right now there's no message from the Democratic Party. The one message that was halfway decent was in the Democratic response, but that clearly did not align with the optics of the night.
I had a conversation on Facebook when I posted last night, if you can't even stand for America's positives. So the families that had the
terrorists being arrested.
Yes. And I got a response back talking about the funding of pediatric cancer being paused. They immediately came at Trump for putting that pause in place. And I just laid out, do you think that if, the spending had not happened for the last 4 years, that we would have the money for the pediatric research? And of course, the tone kind of changed a little bit, but it's so funny how people so easily place blame 44 days in to say, it's Trump's fault. There's no funding available for pediatric cancer research.
He hasn't cured bird flu, so he hasn't fixed the price of eggs. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, like he said, there's going to be a transition period with tariffs if these countries do not decide to have free trade with the United States. And ultimately, I think some of these countries will come back and say, you know what, we make more by trading with the United States than we do in our taxes. So we're going to have free trade with the United States, which I think is ultimately what most people would like to see. But if you're going to tax us when our grandchildren are going in debt to take care of the rest of the world, I don't see how anybody can justify us not having reciprocal tariffs.
How does the GOP capitalize on these moments to present itself as the party of common sense?
Well, I think one is when your opponents act so ridiculous over ridiculous things, it makes you look like you have more common sense regardless. But the truth of the matter is, this president has come in with an abundance of common sense. We're not going to allow bureaucrats to continue to dictate foreign policy, domestic policy, agriculture policy. We're not going to let unelected bureaucrats dictate that. This is going to come from the president of the United States. And I know that Democrats who listen to this are like, but Elon Musk. Elon Musk is acting on behalf and is in constant communication with the president of the United States. These bureaucrats have maybe never even met a president of the United States. And we all know that. They're mid-level bureaucrats who are controlling water policy, soil policy, communications policy. I mean, go down the list and you have mid-level bureaucrats who are dictating policy to the rest of us, and they have no authority to do so outside of presidential authority. And this president has said to stop. And some of them have even said, no, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to continue doing exactly what I'm doing. And I'm more important than the president of the United States.
Your last question for the day. Are these displays of protest effective, or do they just reinforce the perception of a dysfunctional government?
We've had protests. We're talking about the protests by the members of Congress. They demeaned themselves through their protests. The guy who yelled, "You're a liar" to Obama, the Republican who yelled that to Barack Obama during his, I think, 2009 or 2010 speech, demeaned himself. It was not conduct becoming a member of Congress. And you're a member of Congress. You should have a level of decorum when the president of the United States, regardless of who it is, decides to do that. When Marjorie Taylor Greene shouted at Joe Biden during his speech, it was wrong. And so what we need to have happen is both sides need to call out when someone from our side is being ridiculous, even if what they are saying is correct, even if I agree with them, we need to call out their behavior for being conduct unbecoming a member of Congress. Well, I'll call out my side. And that's why one reason why we call it reasonable arguments. And Democrats refuse to do so when their side acts inappropriate. They never do. And so therein lies part of the problem. So then it takes people like me who want to say, hey, listen, hey, Republicans, Matt Gaetz, you got a little bit out of control, right? Marjorie Taylor Greene, reel it in. It silences voices like mine when Democrats decide to be silent when their side decides to act a fool. And we saw a group of people act a fool last night, and it's inappropriate. Nancy Pelosi should call it out, and she won't. Hakeem Jeffries should call it out, and he won't. So it leads me to a point where, why do I have to call it out when it's my side? Democrats expect that from me because we have this blog called Reasonable Arguments. I've been on many Democrat podcasts where I've had these conversations, and they're like, wow, it's so refreshing to hear a Republican call out Republicans. When are you going to do it when your side does? And they refuse. And so there's no blogs, no podcasts called Reasonable Arguments on the Democrat side. You only get reasonable arguments right here by subscribing and liking.
You're absolutely right, because we talked about that last night when Nancy Pelosi ripped up Trump's speech.
Conduct unbecoming,
which you said is a federal offense. And just so everybody knows, when we do these episodes, because of my lack of knowledge, I do research. And one of the things that we researched today was pulling up Biden's speeches. The first one when he was elected, which was during COVID. The room was not that crowded, but
every other seat,
everybody was masked. But I looked these up specifically because I wanted to see how Republicans acted. And so we did look at his last one that he did in 2024. You know, anytime an American positive should be celebrated by standing and clapping, the Republican side did do that. Now, when it was stuff
multiple ovations.
Yes.
Republicans gave Joe Biden multiple ovations just 1 year ago.
Good evening. Good evening. If I were smart, I'd go home now.
If it was absolute neutral territory and about the country, 100% they did. If he was attacking Trump or anything like that, then no, of course that didn't happen. But that's something that I wanted to see for me before coming and doing this podcast, because I didn't want to come into this blind and be like, okay, well, you know, everybody acted a fool last night, but did we also do the same thing years ago? That research has been done. You can see it on YouTube, the videos out there with Biden's speeches. That is all the questions I have for you. So what did we learn today? Well, for one, partisan theater is alive and well in Washington. Trump's speech wasn't just about policies. It was a showcase of the current political climate. Will Congress actually work together to get anything done, or are we just watching another episode of Congressional Survivor, where politicians vote each other off the island rather than doing their damn jobs? One thing is clear, whether you love Trump or can't stand him, he has an undeniable ability to put the contrast between the parties on full display. Last night wasn't just about policy, it was also about priorities. And if nothing else, we now have a clearer picture of what those priorities are. So as always, we want to hear from you. Were you surprised by the reactions in Congress last night? Did you think Trump's policies will hold up, or are they just political promises with no follow through? So drop us a comment, send us a message, and let's keep the conversation going. We did put a poll out on YouTube. So go to our YouTube channel. There is a poll on last night's speech and letting us know what your thoughts were. And don't forget to just subscribe, share, leave us a review, and we will be back next episode with more Reasonable Arguments.
This has been Reasonable Arguments News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time as husband and wife duo Jamie and Jennifer keep it real on Reasonable Arguments.